Here's another discipline. We have financial advising. My discipline is a long-term care planning and insurance specialist. But we also then look at wills and trusts and estate planning. Because if your parents don't have in place powers of attorney, healthcare powers of attorney, the adult kids are going to be hamstrung in terms of what they can even do to help them. It becomes a very different kind of a process.
All right, welcome to CBS Spotlight. If you're here by mistake, you are in the right place now. I am Michael Kohrmann.
I'm Eric Alvarado.
And we are joined today by, again, the one and only Bill Comfort himself, owner of Comfort Long-Term Care and director of training for the CLTC designation. This is part 2 of a 3-part series that we've been doing with Bill, and today we are going to talk about the long-term care conversation and how to have that with aging parents, and then how to have that conversation with your clients.
So, Bill, let's start out with, on this segment just about how would you approach the LTC conversation with, say, aging parents?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because if you think about this whole subject, kind of the broad subject is planning for care. It's not only providing for parents and their care, but either from the parents' perspective or their adult children's perspective, it's providing for the parents' care while protecting the rest of the family, their lives, lifestyle, and so on as well. So it truly ideally can and should be a cross-generational type of a planning process and a conversation. It's not an easy conversation to have in many families. Sometimes older parents they don't want to talk about it. Don't you worry about it. We'll take care of ourselves. We don't want you to take care of us. I mean, there's a lot of kind of possible answers. But I think the first thing to think about is how old are the parents? So I'm 61 and I have 4 kids who are in their 20s and 30s. And if you ask them, they might say I'm aging. Now, I'm going to resist that label, reflexively myself. But my mom is 85 and is still strongly and fiercely independent. So, but my mom is past the stage of being able to buy long-term care insurance. So whether, if you have parents, particularly mid to late 70s into their 80s, the conversation is not so much around planning ahead for care, but talking about what's already in place. And here's another discipline. We have financial advising. My discipline is a long-term care planning and insurance specialist, but we also then look at wills and trusts and estate planning. Because if your parents don't have in place powers of attorney, healthcare powers of attorney, the adult kids are going to be hamstrung in terms of what they can even do to help them. It becomes a very different kind of a process. Now, good estate planning. Somebody has an estate planning attorney, if they've done even the basics, a basic will, that almost always includes the healthcare power of attorney and the general durable power of attorney. So a question adult kids might ask of older adults is, have you updated? Who's the power of attorney? How does it work? Let's just talk about it. Let's see what's there. And of course, it could get into money things as well. For adult kids whose parents are in their 50s and 60s, the conversation is, Mom, Dad, what have you done to plan for care? Kind of another way to look at this is thinking about it from those adult kids' perspective. They're worried about having to take care of mom and dad. They're worried about protecting their lives, their lifestyle, their opportunity, and want to make sure their parents have made provisions. And it's a critically important conversation. In the last segment, in part one, we talked about how every client needs a conversation with their financial advisor that's individualized and detailed. And I often get this question, well, Bill, what about clients in their 30s? Maybe start by asking them about their parents.
Oh,
That's how you have the long-term care planning conversation with younger people who probably need more life and disability insurance in their lives before they buy any more long-term care in their 30s, for example. But what's the life stage of the parents, Eric? And that's really what drives the how to have the conversation. I think the hardest thing for adult kids is when the parents, for whatever reason, pride, privacy, just family relationships, don't want to talk about it. Just start planting the seeds. Tell the parents that it's important to you, the adult kid, to understand what plans they have in place. And again, you've got to have those legal documents done. I mean, you asked in the first part, who should be having this planning conversation? Everyone. Who should have those basic estate planning documents done? Everyone. First step, no matter what.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Bill.
Long-term care insurance or not? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. No, I did this with my parents, and I actually did my power of attorney as well when my parents did, because it dawned on me, I don't have one. And I do now, so someone can do something when I'm inevitably incapacitated or something of that. But it's a great way to open up that door for that conversation. Use yourself.
Michael, it also has to do with how is that adult parent living? If the adult parent is single, there's not a natural legal person. Hopefully it would be a responsible adult kid. But at least if you're legally married, there's a presumption that your legal spouse can make some decisions for you. Medical decisions, maybe you have joint bank accounts. This is also true for couples that are not legally married, right? There's not a legal presumption of authority. So, sometimes, if a parent is single, who's going to provide the care? How's it going to be done? Do they want to stay at home? Is there anyone around who can help manage that care in the parent's home? Because there's a single person doesn't have that built-in sort of supervisor of a spouse or partner that could be there. What about ex-spouses? How does that work? What about couples that have blended families? So her adult children might actually be more worried about what happens if their stepfather needs care versus their mother, right? So
that's a good point.
The family dynamic, I think, Eric, this is why your question is so great. How can kids talk to parents about it? It gets complicated, but just because it's complicated doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And it just has to be as simple as, let's talk about your plans for care and what do you want and not want? And it's kind of like the estate planning conversation and process, but this is for incapacity during life versus after death.
Makes sense. Thank you. Well, all right, Eric, you asked the really good one about the individual parents. I'm going to go for the other side of the coin then. How do you start this conversation with the clients, with your advising clients?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, there's a lot of surveys that have been done in the financial planning, financial advising community that shows that clients want their advisors to raise this subject. I mean, like 8 out of 10 will say they want their advisor to raise this subject.
Wow.
And advisors, it's less than half say that they regularly do it. And we have such a low penetration of people who actually own long-term care insurance that doesn't surprise me at all. And let me say this. I can be critical of advisors who are not raising it with every client and having a meaningful conversation. But I have to say, a lot of advisors are not raising the subject proactively. They're reacting. If a client says, what do you know about
Sure.
long-term care or long-term care insurance? Can we buy some tomorrow, please?
Mm-hmm.
By the way, is it any
Yeah.
wonder that advisors see so many declines, right? Because if the client's
It's 'cause
begging
when-
to be sold an insurance policy, maybe they know
It's
they're,
because they need it.
They're
right.
in trouble.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but kind of to an advisor's credit, who's doing a lot of things, whether they have a CFP or not, if they're working at a fiduciary level or managing, money at a very, high quality level, there's a lot going on that they have to keep track of and be knowledgeable about. Taxes and investments and diversification and so on. So I think a lot of advisors hesitate to raise the subject because they don't know how to have the conversation. They don't know how to manage the conversation, or they don't want to get caught with a question they don't know the answer to.
Right.
So,
Makes sense.
Right.
to their credit, maybe they shouldn't be bringing up a subject that they don't have an expertise in. Well, if that's the case, and if that's honestly where they are, they need to have a partner. They need to have a partner like at, CBS, right?
Yeah.
That
Pick me.
has that expertise, that can even help run that conversation, at a client level, and that's part of my practice as well as is partnering with advisors. But let me make it a little simpler than maybe a lot of people think it is. The conversation does not start with long-term care insurance. That's the last thing. The conversation starts with, so we've already said in some detail in part one, everything we're doing is based on you expecting to live to 90, if not longer. And the risk of needing care is magnified by longevity in the same way. If you live to 90 or longer, don't you think it's reasonable you could need care for a few years? Yeah, I suppose so. And then the next question, it's planning. It's just sort of playing out the next step. And that is, so if either of you needed care, let's assuming we're talking to a couple, if either of you needed care, how would that look? What would you want? Which is no different than saying, where do you plan to live when you retire? What's that lifestyle look like? What are the hobbies? What are the activities? What's the travel? Well, with long-term care, do you want to stay at home, if possible, as long as possible? Do you know there's alternatives like assisted living that can keep you out of a nursing home, right? That's just sort of and then the third piece, to kind of keep this simple for the moment, is, look, care, professional care at home or in a residential setting is expensive. How will you pay for it? And a key thing is, how will you pay for it while keeping your other financial commitments? And what a good financial planner and financial advisor has already, they already know for and with the client what those other priorities are. Let me give you an example. Client has or is well on their way to having enough money, enough income to live the way they want to live in retirement.
Mm-hmm.
But if one of them needs care, home care today is $35 an hour, which is $6,000 a month plus, just for 40 hours a week. That's a full-time job for somebody, but it ain't 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
$6,000 a month for home care.
Wow.
Where will you get an extra $6,000 a month? It's particularly for couples where both, if not the still independent spouse, still wants to live a lifestyle. Now, maybe they co-insure some of it. And that's, I think in the planning conversation, advisors need to check some of their conventional wisdom at the door And one of those things is that this is a zero-sum decision, that somehow you're either going to buy long-term care insurance to cover 100% of everything, or you're just going to pay out of pocket for everything. And that's,
It's
if you stop and think
that's not what
about it,
anyone's going for.
exactly. So
Yeah.
how do you have the conversation with clients? My same charge from the last segment that we did, just start talking about it. And if you need help
Yeah.
with product detail, if you need help for a client that's maybe a little harder to manage with the subject, bring in a specialist, bring in a partner.
Yep.
The same way you refer tax expertise out, or legal expertise out. Don't be afraid to have someone else help you with that, because it really is, I believe, a specialty area at this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, makes sense.
Great response. Absolutely. Agree with you 100%.
So in that same vein then, Bill, how do you ask a client what their long-term care plan of action is?
I think one way to start is to just ask it the way you just asked me. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, I want to talk to you about a subject we've never addressed before, but is really critical to your long-term financial security. And that is, what is your long-term care plan of action? And I think if that's being done proactively, the advisor needs to be ready for a couple of things. One is the clients might say, what do you mean? The advisor might need to define a little bit what long-term care is. And it's not a place, it's the impairment. It's the event, it's the disability, if you like. It's needing help with those physical activities or supervision for care. How would you want to manage that? A question that I ask often, and it's one of those questions where you kind of already know the answer for most people, but if somebody says, well, what do you mean by that, or a plan of action? I'll say, well, let's just take one example as a starting point. And again, I'm going to presume I'm talking to a couple here for the moment, but it could be the same question for a single person. If possible, as long as possible, would you want to remain in your own home? And
most people, they want to. Yeah, they want to stay put.
They'll say yes. And if they're
Yeah.
thoughtful, they might say, well, I guess it depends on the circumstances. And of course, we can't know the circumstances.
Right.
And I might suggest, and if you can't stay at home, would you want the option to be able to use more of a residential setting like assisted living versus an institutional setting like a nursing home? And I use those words very sort of carefully and precisely there. And part of this is, well, let me say it another way. When you're asking clients about their plan for care, don't talk about nursing homes. Just don't. Nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to plan to go there. And yes, it's potentially, kind of the most expensive kind of care. But claims data with long-term care shows us people who own long-term care insurance, so they've planned ahead and they have the extra financial wherewithal from the insurance benefits, very few people with long-term care insurance ever end up in a nursing home. Certainly not to live their days out. They might go in for 30 days for rehab after surgery, but they're not living out their days there because they made plans. So it's sort of fascinating to me how many advisors still talk about, let's talk about your plans for care in a nursing home. Everybody's going to shut down.
Jump straight to the finish line right out the gate.
Start, I like to say, first things first, home care. Let's solve for, navigate home care. If the client says yes, that would be our priority, if possible, as long as possible. For single people, particularly single people without children, it's very hard for them to stay at home. Who makes sure the caregiver even shows up? let alone, we always hear that nursing homes are the most expensive form of care. No, 24/7 home care is. If you do the math, $35 an hour times 24/7 is like $20,000 a month.
Wow.
Now, somebody might want that.
Sure.
And then the sort of the transition question is, so how will you pay for it? Well, don't we have enough money? And listen, here's my advice to advisors. Play it out. Run it out. Plug it into the planning software as a new expense starting at age 80 for 4 or 5 years. Game it out. Is that what you would want?
Yep.
How would it work? How would you pay for it? You might have enough money, but let's examine it. I think, again, how do you start the conversation? You just start the conversation. Most advisors, most experienced advisors, they know how to do this. They're just not used to doing it. Let me say one other little thing. Maybe what they need to do is their own plan first.
Ooh, I like
Excellent.
that. Start with your own plan
Excellent
first,
point.
and then you can move on to your clients.
Yep.
Because
and you will
got to
learned.
answer this question
Best
for
way to
you
learn.
too.
Yeah. Best way to learn.
That is the best way to learn. Well, thank you very much, Bill, for taking the time to speak with us today. We really, really appreciate it. Do you have any closing comments for the audience?
Listen, the questions are great, and I really appreciate getting to talk about this, both from how do families talk about the subject together, as well as how do advisors talk to their clients. And the best plans for care are when both of those things happen effectively. It's a great way to look at this subject. So thanks for that opportunity.
Very well said. Well, I am Michael Kohrmann.
And I'm Eric Alvarado.
And this has been CBS Spotlight, your friendly conversation where insurance and wealth advising come together. This has been part 2 of a 3-part series that we've been doing with Bill on long-term care. So please stay tuned for our next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you find this content helpful. But part 3 will be the actual discussion on what your LTC options are. So what tools are available out there in the long-term care space. But join us next time. Thanks.